fellas in so they can introduce themselves. How's it going, guys? How you doing? You go say hi, John?
I'm doing all right. Sorry.
A little bit delayed there. It's all good, man. Thank you guys for joining me on this episode. And if you remember Mr. Edward Andrews, he actually joined me, I think over about a year ago now, I would say. And we talked about some textual criticism stuff, some textual stuff. I can't remember the exact topic per se, but we had a great time talking about that. And if you remember John, he actually came on when I first started hosting debates, and he debated Jonathan McLatchie. And that was a fun debate as well. That was a very, very fun debate. So I'm going to let these guys introduce themselves to the audience. So if you guys take a little bit of time, Mr. Edwards, can you go ahead and give a quick introduction of yourself?
Yeah, my name, of course, is Edward Andrews. I've been a Christian for 32 years. I'm also a Christian author. I've written 140 plus books. I'm also a chief translator for the Updated American Standard Version. And I also have a blog, Christian Publishing House blog. Thousands of articles on there, 70-something different subject areas. And I also own Christian Publishing House. And we have published 30-something authors, several hundred books, conservative, and just defending the faith. So.
All right, cool. Mr. Edward Andrews, thank you so much for joining me in this episode of The Gospel Truth. All right, Mr. John Gleason, Godless engineer, go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself.
Well, I am John Gleason, the Godless engineer. You can find me here on YouTube at Godless engineer, as well as other platforms out there. Pretty much anywhere that you go, I'm just Godless engineer. What I do is I try to critically analyze apologist claims to give people the best arguments and information so that they can stand up and use their voice in whatever way that they choose to. I have a mixture of different people that like to watch my content and find themselves educated by it. So if you want to similarly be educated in the field of religious studies and other topics around that kind of topic, go on and subscribe to me over on Godless Engineer.
All right, thank you guys once again for joining me, and we are excited to have this debate. So the topic of this debate is the reliability of the New Testament historically and textually. How reliable is the New Testament? And this is going to be a great debate. A lot of great information is going to be thrown out there. And so we're going to start this debate out with 10-minute opening statements by each party. Then we go transition to 5-minute rebuttal rounds. After that, we have about a 15-minute open discussion between you two. Then we'll go follow that with a 5-minute closing and then Q&A from the audience. Everything sounds good?
Yes.
All right.
Yep, good to me.
I think we agreed that, John, you would go first. So you are up for your 10-minute opening statement, John.
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to be able to get through all of what I've gotten written for my opening statement, but I'll do my best. So first, I want to thank Marlon for arranging this debate, as well as Edwards for having this debate with me. There are many different ways to engage this topic of the historical reliability of the New Testament. Is the New Testament text reliable? I don't think that it is. Does the New Testament relay accurate historical information? I don't think it does that either. What sources does the New Testament use to give us the historical information that it does? Well, there were no historical sources that were used for the New Testament. I intend to prove today that the New Testament is simply not historically reliable in any way by examining these questions. So, first off, let's ask the question of whether or not the New Testament text is reliable. Textual reliability of the New Testament is a big subject on its own. I'm by no means an expert in this field. If you want an expert analysis of this subject, I suggest either Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus or Richard Carrier's work on this particular topic. The issue of textual reliability is that the earliest complete manuscript that we have was created in the 4th century. The Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus represent a snapshot of the Bible as it existed in the 4th century. Using those codexes, as well as others, from the 5th century, we are able to track how the Bible's content changed throughout time. We find that errors and deliberate changes were rampant right after the 4th century. Thousands of changes occurred. Some were spelling mistakes, but even those can change the theology expressed. Like in Luke 2:14, in the KJV version, has on peace on earth, goodwill toward men. But this is a result of a spelling error because the original was actually peace on earth for men whom God pleases. Newer translations of the Bible have accounted for this fact and no longer have the incorrect reading. Another good example is 1 Corinthians 15:6, where Paul recites his Pauline Creed and claims that 500 people saw Jesus rose from the dead. Or, well, the risen Jesus. A common spelling error could have happened here, which would turn that claim of 500 people seeing a resurrected Jesus to Jesus appearing to people over the course of the Pentecost. In Mark 1:41, the current text says that Jesus was moved with pity to help a leper, but in the Codex, I'm gonna mispronounce this, but it's Bezay, or I can't pronounce it. I'm so sorry. It says Jesus was angry with the leper. While most Greek texts have that Jesus felt pity, the Codex Bezay is corroborated by 3 Latin texts. It's most likely that this change was made in the 2nd century. Ultimately, we don't know what was originally there, but the earliest content we can reconstruct has Jesus becoming angry with this person. Another 2nd century change to Mark is the ending of Mark. The post-resurrection appearance by Jesus in Mark 16:9 through 20 originally did not appear in Mark and was inserted by a later scribe. We really don't know if there was anything after Mark 16:8 or not. There could be a whole portion of the first gospel written that has been lost to time. These are all examples of changes that we know about. The earliest codices represent a lead wall that we simply cannot see past. While we have evidence of changes that most likely occurred behind that lead wall, we cannot know for sure. What we know is that as time progressed after the 4th century, we find the number of errors reduced as more people became literate and the printing press was invented. It would be illogical to assume that the number of changes and errors prior to the 4th century was less than what we know to have occurred in the 4th century or after the 4th century. The thousands of errors that occurred after that lead wall pale in comparison to the number of changes that most likely occurred prior to that. I think that it's pretty safe to say that the New Testament is simply not textually reliable and most likely doesn't represent what was originally written. Next, does the New Testament relay accurate historical information? The New Testament shouldn't be treated as a single book in this context. Each individual section of the New Testament was written at a specific time by either Paul or an anonymous author. It's important to look at each one individually. Paul doesn't really discuss much history surrounding Jesus. He is primarily concerned with the theology of the Christian religion, not history. So next, let's turn to look at the Gospels. The Gospels are ripe with historical inaccuracies. I don't feel the need to go into every single historical inaccuracy in the Gospels, but let's touch on a few. In Matthew, the slaughter of the innocents is not recorded anywhere in secular history, yet it represents a pivotal moment in the birth of Jesus. Josephus writes extensively on Herod and fails to discuss this particular incident. Mark, as well as Matthew and Luke, discuss a mysterious darkness that covered the land when Jesus died. Since later Gospels used Mark as a source, it's understandable that they would include this. It also means that Mark is the sole source of this information and is not referenced elsewhere in secular history. Thallus, as quoted by others, correctly identifies how unreasonable it is to expect an eclipse around the time of Passover when Jesus was supposedly crucified. Because we can do basic math and figure out exactly when eclipses would have occurred. No eclipses occurred to where it would affect Judea, let alone was there a full eclipse that ever happened for 3 hours. Matthew records an earthquake happening that is not recorded by other secular historians. Luke, and subsequently Acts, has been thoroughly shown to be historical fiction. Not only does Luke completely disagree with Jesus' birth narrative by placing him 10 years after Matthew's story, but the author of Luke has used Josephus, as well as others, to create his overall narrative. The Gospel of John was most likely written in the 2nd century and also relies on the existing Gospels to write his narrative of Jesus. One particular proof for this is the fact that John's Lazarus story is a direct rebuttal to Luke's Lazarus story. This leads to questioning the sources used for all the Gospels and Paul. Paul insists that he did not get his information from any historical source and only gets his information from visions and scriptures. Even if he had received any information from a historical source, he wouldn't consider it true unless Jesus told him in a vision or he read it in scripture. The Gospels don't cite any historical sources at all and instead only cite scripture. All proposed documents that are speculated to be the sources for the Gospels are simply ad hoc explanations that have no real evidence to support them. So when you critically examine the books of the New Testament, you're really only left with Paul as your sole source of independent information. Mark and inherently all the Gospels use Paul for their information and theology. Paul is the only author that is positioned to be able to give us accurate historical information. Like the fact that Peter most likely existed and was a prominent figure in the early church. The Gospels being written 20 years or more later normally wouldn't be a problem for historians, except when those documents fail to cite any reliable contemporary sources, which the Gospels failed to do. It is this fatal flaw in the New Testament that renders most of it unusable as historical source for anything. And I don't know how far that got me on my time, but I guess I'll see the rest of it for Edwards.
All right. Thank you so much for that opening statement. All right, Mr. Edwards. Andrews, we got you. You're up for your 2-minute opening.
Okay. First thing, there's no S on the end of Edward.
All right, no problem.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is run through some of the complaints Bible critics have brought up against the New Testament and the Bible in general. First, I would make the opening statement that there are no errors, mistakes, or contradictions in the original manuscripts. The Bible difficulties, and there's a reason that they're Bible difficulties. What we have is 40 authors writing 6 books over 1,000 different languages, Hebrew, or Greek. And this is done dozens and dozens of historical settings. We'll talk more about Bible difficulties in a moment. But let's deal with the literacy level between 33 and 350. In other words, between the time that Jesus was executed and Constantine the Great. Many scholars argue that the literacy rate in the Roman Empire was no greater than 10 to 20%. This is a mistaken notion. The Roman world was overflowing with documents, historical, religious, military, commercial, poetry, and so on. The Roman citizens had long believed that reading and writing strengthened them. Rulers were not going to take it them if they could read and write. We cannot take and aggregate data by it to individuals. For example, wage in New York City, $45,000 a year. John Smith lives, so he makes $45,000 a year. You cannot do that. It just doesn't make any, just kind of easy to understand right there by itself. Christianity grew out of a melting pot of languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Coptic, and Syriac. Most of the people living in the Roman Empire knew 2 to 3 different languages. Bad time to get a phone call. Okay. So, sorry about that, people. So letter writing was very popular also in the Roman Empire. Hundreds of thousands of letters have been discovered over the past century by archaeologists. 40 to 100 million people were living throughout the Roman Empire, and 1 million of them were Christians, between 125 and 150. We're only referring to 2% of the population. There is no way to arrive at a specific statistic for the level of literacy for this small selection in a time when history focused on the prominent, not the common people. It's the Roman emperors, it's the wealthy people, it's the senators that got into the history books, not the common person. Public writings in and throughout the Roman cities were graffiti, gravestones, tombs, Roman libraries, and they even had newspapers. Graffiti inundated the entire Roman Empire, And this is not just like the graffiti you see from gangs in the inner cities. This is poetry. This is people responding to the poetry. This is writing on the walls. This is substantive. And this is from your common people. Pompeii was a prosperous population of 15,000 people in the Roman Empire. There was it's only 15,000 people, but it's a small city. But there was over 11,000 graffiti samples that have been found in that city. Beginning in 1778 and continuing to the end of the 19th century, many papyrus texts were accidentally discovered in Egypt that dated from 300 BCE to 500 CE, almost 5,000 documents in all. Culturally, the Israelite people themselves generally could read and write with few exceptions. Jesus would have been taught to read and write by his father, Joseph. Jesus would have also received an education in the scriptures from the attendant at the synagogue, starting at 5 years old. That was Jewish tradition. Paul wrote 14 letters. Peter wrote 2. John wrote 3. Both Jude and James wrote 1 each. Paul exhorted others to copy his letters and read them. Of course, this is not going to be believed, but you also have the gift of the languages by the Holy Spirit. It seems that these so-called illiterate Christians were able to grow from 120 disciples in 33 CE to some 1 million Christians by 125 CE, a mere 92 years later. And here are historically some non-Christian witnesses that refer to Jesus. Roman historian Tacitus, 55 to 120 CE, Jewish historian Josephus, 37 to 100, Roman satirist and poet Juvenal, Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca from 4 BC to 65, Greek orator and philosopher Chrysostom from 40 to 115, Greek historian, public servant, military commander Arrian from 89 to 160, Roman historian Suetonius from 69 to 122, the governor of Bithynia, Pliny the Younger, 61 to 113. And these are enemies. An enemy of Christians, a Greek satirist, Lucian, 125 to 180, also referred to Christ. An enemy of Christians, a Greek philosopher named Numenius, mid-2nd century, that's about 150. An enemy of Christianity, Greek historian Phlegon, middle 2nd century. An enemy of Christians, a Greek philosopher Celsus, middle 2nd century. And what you notice about these people, it is literally decades from the time of the actual authors themselves and even Christ himself. Logical fallacies, circumstantial ad hominem fallacy. Circumstantial ad hominem fallacy is an attack on my being a Christian, so therefore I must be biased on all things related to my being a Christian. The truth of a view is independent of the one who is a Christian. This is a double-edged sword because the atheist view would also be biased simply because he is an atheist. Then you have the genetic fallacy and this is on behalf of the poor, like a person born in Pakistan would likely be a Muslim, a person born in Ireland would likely be a Catholic. So their beliefs are culturally relative so that they are not objectively true. This fallacy is trying to invalidate a view by showing that a person came to hold that view based on where they live. The truth of the view is independent of the person that came to believe it. This is another double-edged sword because a person living in Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, San Francisco, California, New York City might likely be an atheist. So then we would just have to say that's objectively not true. What is evidence as to ancient history? The available body of facts of information indicating whether a belief or proposition is true or valid, aiding us to also determine what happened. Information gathered, drawn from a document or from other materials. Ancient history belongs to the rich and the powerful. Common people generally receive no coverage in ancient history. If I were to ask you, what do you know about the modern country of Montserrat? No one would have a clue. If I asked you to tell me a little bit about a retired modern-day sailor called John O'Donovan, there would be complete silence. But this does not mean that the country Montserrat and the person John O'Donovan did not exist or do not exist because they're current. Jesus was neither rich nor powerful. He did not even have a home that he could call his own for 3.5 years. He was a carpenter's son. He lived in a small village called Nazareth that had a couple hundred people in it. The governor of the region of Judea, whose capital was Jerusalem, that had a population of 600,000 persons in Jesus' day, was Pontius Pilate. And we only have two pieces of archaeological evidence that refer to that prominent governor, yet we have 12 different secular pieces, which I just read to you above, who offers us historical evidence for the historicity of Jesus. The Bible critic discounts the Old Testament manuscripts, both Hebrew and Greek, that date back to 2,300 years ago as archaeological evidence. They discount the manuscripts of the New Testament. They date back 1,719 years ago as archaeological evidence because they're supposedly biased. The manuscripts of the Roman historians Suetonius and Tacitus are not discounted as biased, even though they're Romans writing about Rome. The manuscripts of the Jewish historian Josephus are not discounted as biased, even though he's a Jew writing about Jewish history. The manuscripts of the Greek historians Herodotus and Thucydides are not discounted as biased, and they're Greeks writing about the Greek Empire. In other words, the Greek New Testament scriptures are worthy of at least as much confidence and reliance as secular histories. We have 5,988 Greek New Testament manuscripts that have been cataloged, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and an additional 9,300 other manuscripts in such languages as Syriac, Slavic, Gothic, Ethiopic, Coptic, and Armenian. The papyrus is a copy of a portion of the New Testament made on a papyrus plant. That's the paper of the day. At present, we have 140 cataloged New Testament papyri, many dating between 110 and 350 CE. This is why the Bible critic does not want us to have that evidence as evidence, because the secular sources would only dream of having such evidence. You have those historians that I just mentioned that might have 2 or 3 manuscripts that date 800 years after the fact, and yet they are considered reliable. Homer, who wrote the Iliad, is considered 95% accurate based on manuscripts that are dated hundreds of years after his time. It is almost impossible to prove by historical arguments the truth of every single detail in ancient writing, whether it be the Bible or secular history. It is enough to have reasonable and rational confidence in their author's general truthfulness if we can establish that. There is an inferred, self-evident likelihood that his details are true. The New Testament is not less likely to be historically true simply because Christians receive it as the Word of God. And I know I'm probably running out of time and probably went over, but rating the level of evidence, I think that's important because a person has the right to do whatever they want based on the level of certainty that to accept as a risk. And because I have 2 years in criminal law before I started my religious degree, so we'll use criminal justice as a means, terms to put this out there. Plausible. The reading may have been original, but it is not probably so, because it's only about 40% plausible. A preponderance of evidence, 55%, the reading could have been original in that it is enough to accept it as such unless there's something else that overrules it. Convincing evidence, 80%. The reading surely was original in that the evidence is enough to accept it as substantially certain unless something else proves it otherwise. Beyond a reasonable doubt, the reading must have been original and that there is no reason to doubt it. Skepticism. Scientific skepticism, willing to question any claim to truth, asking for clarity and definition, consistency and logic and adequacy of evidence. Pseudo-skepticism, false. These people are not interested in truth, but rather only in the defense of a preconceived ideological position. The false skeptic has never personally taken the time or shown any interest in weighing alternatives, investigating Bible difficulties or textual variants, or trying to honestly understand rational, reasonable, logical explanations. But the pseudo-skeptic only wants to promote their particular belief structure and conclusions. Selective skepticism, what they like, what they don't like, they reject it out of hand. All right.
That's time.
Apologies.
No worries. All right. So now we're going to transition to our 5-minute rebuttal rounds. Mr. Godless Engineer, John Gleason, you have 5 minutes to rebut Edward.
Okay. Thank you so much for your opening there, Edward. Sorry for calling you Edwards. I don't know why I wrote it down as Edwards, but thank you, Edward, for your opening. I'd like to, in the open discussion part, I'd like to kind of, for us to discuss why you think that there's no errors, mistakes, or contradictions in the Bible, at least in what we have, taking into consideration what I mentioned in my opening, being that our earliest complete codex, dates back to the 4th century. We can't see anything previous to that, but we can obviously detect textual variants and textual errors and deliberate changes later on in the text. You did mention a bunch of secular historians, I'll say non-Christian historians that seem to corroborate, or at least I think that you were trying to use them to suggest that they corroborate what the Gospels say. For instance, like Pliny, Seneca, Lucian, Celsus, all of them. I mean, they all, like, the ultimate place where they got their information would have been the Gospels, and this is due to the fact that of the time and place that they were writing in. Definitely, Pliny the Younger was getting his information from Christians because he was interrogating Christians. So any information he would have gotten would have come from the Christian ideas of the 2nd century, which by the 2nd century, when Pliny was interrogating them, they would have all had access to at least the synoptic Gospels, if not also John. So there's that. Maybe we can discuss that a little bit further as to why you think people like Pliny or Seneca actually support the historicity of the New Testament. I kind of felt like your opening statement was more generalized for a lot of different types of atheists out there, because you said that I would be biased against the New Testament's material, I guess, because I'm an atheist. But really, I became an atheist before I even knew anything about the historical reliability of the New Testament. I was not convinced. Once I dove deep into what I actually believed, I was just not convinced of the divineness of Jesus Christ, as well as whether or not he resurrected. So, I mean, my atheism doesn't hold me back or anything like that from accepting any kind of historical nature of the New Testament. I just find it way too dubious to actually find any historical value in the New Testament for all of the reasons that I've already listed before, and we can go over those. You talked about discounting the Septuagint or the Old Testament or any of that as archaeological evidence of anything. Actually, my own position relies heavily on what the Septuagint says and how that feeds into how the New Testament was constructed and how the Septuagint in the Old Testament affects Paul's theology. So if we really wanted to discuss that, we can get into that too. And then you kind of briefly mentioned about how Suetonius, Tacitus, and Josephus would have, like, why aren't they considered biased? Excuse me. Why aren't they considered biased? While other writers, or like Christian writers, would have been biased. I mean, as far as this particular conversation goes, I think that anybody that's faithfully holding to a dogma has an obvious, overwhelming bias to this particular subject, but I don't think that you yourself are necessarily biased. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe I just don't remember, but I don't exactly know why you brought up Suetonius, Tacitus, Josephus as being whether or not they'd be considered biased as Roman historians or whatnot. At least I know Josephus is kind of a Roman historian, Tacitus too. But and then you mentioned the amount of manuscripts that we have, and I would just say that, we don't ever consider the amount of manuscripts to be indicative of how true something is. In textual criticism, if a certain saying has more has more copies, depending on the time and place in which it was written, could be an indication of what was originally there. But I feel like the order in which something is written is more important than, how many copies we actually have. So I believe that's all of my time. Thank you. And maybe we can get to more in the discussion period.
All right. Thank you, John. All right, Edward, you are up for a 5-minute rebuttal.
Yeah, I think you misunderstood some of that, so it'd be good for the discussion period to, because I kind of blitzed through it, and I apologize for that. Okay, you get to the manuscripts in Bart Ehrman. Let's just say Bart Ehrman is an agnostic Bible critic. He's a New Testament critic. I consider him to be an antichrist in opposition to Christ because he works in opposition to Christ. Certainly fits the term. I consider him to be an apostate, and I'm not doing an ad hominem attack. It's what he does. He misrepresents, he misinforms, he misleads in his book, Misquoting Jesus, that you had recommended to the people. What he does is give you a certain percentage of the truth, and then he leaves certain things out to give you. For instance, if I told you that in the United States will make up 14% of the population, but they also make up 7% of the prison population, that would give you an impression that black people are the vast majority of the crime, would it not? But if I left out the fact that the majority of the people with a black person, a white person, go to trial for the same crime, same situation, 90% of the time, the black person is going to get to prison, and the white person will repeatedly get probation for a few times until, the judge gets fed up with them. And that's statistically. So when we leave that out of the equation, it changes the whole perspective that you would have had about black people. And it's the same thing about the manuscripts. When you leave pieces of information out, then, yeah, there are 400,000 scribal errors in the Greek New Testament manuscripts, but there are 5,898 Greek New Testament manuscripts. So you can see how one would get to 400,000 errors quite quickly. But what he doesn't, what you don't have, for instance, you say Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, to them as the earliest complete manuscripts. That's true, but we have other manuscripts that date prior to those. All right, we have manuscripts. P66, Papyrus 66, dates to 110 to 150 CE. All right, it's made up a lot of the Gospels. So therefore, that in there would have to match. Let me give you the history. So the early manuscripts come from Alexandria in Egypt, and that's because they're found in the drive of Alexandria in Egypt. And the Alexandrian scribes were largely professional scribes and made mistakes. It's later on that the manuscripts in the Byzantine area, because he took control of Christianity and the world, that those manuscripts, the Byzantine scribes had to add material. So that's why the later manuscripts, the biggest corruptions, not the earliest manuscripts. So when you look at the earliest manuscripts that you're referring to, the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, the earlier papyri manuscripts, which we have 140 that date prior to, and some of them, a large portion of them, are within decades of the apostles and decades of the writing, match up with the Sinaiticus, match up with the Byzantine text that comes later. And what you're also not is that 85 to 90% of the manuscripts agree. They agree. It's 85 to 90% of the manuscripts agree with each other. It's only a very small 10% that's in disagreement. And of that 10 to 15, the reason having so many is a good thing is that you establish which one is the original reading that you have, the better, because then you're able to get back to what the original authors wrote. Now, of those 10 to 15%, 95% of those are insignificant, Jesus Christ or Christ Jesus, or a punctuation or an accent mark. It's something small. It's not nothing major. Yes, there are some significant ones. There are a handful. You're right. Mark 16:8-20 or 9 was not a part of the original. The adulterers that where Jesus was drawn in the sand in John chapter 7 and 8, not a part of the original. So the Trinitarian 1 John 5:7, not a part of the original. So Ehrman is right. But what's being missed in all of this is how much the manuscripts do agree, the insignificance of the manuscripts. And if I may borrow just a second here, we have 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament. And what you have is you have textual variants, but then you have a textual unit. A textual unit is a verse, and there might be different variants or ways that that verse is expressed. But the textual unit is the verse, all right? But within that, there's variants, all right? Of the textual units, there are 505 that are beyond reasonable doubt. We know what they say, no arguments. There are 523 clear and convincing evidence that what's the original. There are 354 that it's difficulty to it to decide, but we can decide. There are 10 that have great difficulty to decide. 10. That's it. Nothing more. So
right, that's time right there.
I don't want to come across.
Right there, Edward.
Yeah.
That's time right there. All right.
Okay.
We are going to transition to the cross-examination round. Well, basically, it's an open discussion between you two for about 50 minutes. Right. And so if you guys not sure who wants to go first or throw a question at who, and you guys have the stage, man. So open it up.
Well, if you just let me, I'll just take a couple seconds to clarify because you had some misunderstandings on things that I was saying. And also, don't take my inflections as, I apologize there. I think my tone kind of got off a little bit and I came across maybe being a little too dogmatic. I apologize for that. No, I was naming because some of the atheists, they'll say that, Christian is naturally biased because he's Christian. And I put none of that on you because, like I said, I watched some of your videos. And so I was trying to cross a general board here. And some of the atheists will say, well, you can't trust the New Testament manuscripts because, it's Christian copyists copying the New Testament manuscripts, which is not entirely true. A lot of the manuscripts were made in scriptoriums by professional scribes that weren't even Christians at all. They were just hired to do a job. But in that argument, too, you would have to take Flavius Josephus, who's a Jewish person, and his writings about the history of Jews and say that, hey, he's biased, too. You'd have to take the Greek historians and say they're biased about their Greek history. Not you per se. When I use you in our conversation, it's a plural meant in a general way. But if they're going to say the one thing about the one, then they got to certainly say the other thing about the other. And I also didn't mention those 12 people to validate the history of the Gospels. I mentioned them because they mentioned Jesus Christ as a historical person. And when you get to the 2nd century, much hasn't changed. The early 2nd century, 100 to 150, much hasn't changed by then. You're right. By the time you get to 200, you have 28 varieties of Christianity, and there's a breaking apart, and problems have arisen. But up until the time period we're talking about with those 12 different people, they're getting their information from Christians because they went from 120 people in an upper room in 33 to by 125, 150 being over 1 million Christians. And so the people that are referring to Christ are doing that based on because these people were evangelizing. Every Christian saw their job and their task as evangelizing. So them are kind of the things I thought that you might have misunderstood about what I was saying. So I thought I'd throw that out there.
Okay. Well, what about, what do you think about any of my arguments that I laid out in my opening? I know that you mentioned Papyrus 56 as a way that we know something behind this lead curtain that I talked about. Papyrus 56 only gives us very little information about Acts 1.
52.
It seems.
Sorry.
I don't know much about Papyrus 56. I quickly looked it up, and it just says that it only covers Acts 1:1, 4, Acts 1:4 through 5, Acts 1:7, 1:10 through 11.
66,
huh?
Not 56. 66. 66.
Oh, 66. Oh, my bad. I totally misheard that.
Yeah, it covers a lot of the Gospels, and P75 is another one that covers almost all of Luke and almost all of John. So P52 would be one that you might see. There's sometimes that something gives you evidence that you don't think that it can give you evidence. For example, that John was in the second century is a common argument. Since it argued in the 1800s that John wasn't written until 160 or 170. And then when P52 was discovered, which is a fragment of the Gospel of John, it dates to 110 to 125 or 100 to 150, within decades in Egypt. So it had to take time to get to Egypt. And so clearly that pushes John back to the late first century for his writing of the Gospel. So even a little fragment manuscript right there shut up the Bible critics for 100 years on that particular point.
Well, yeah, but I mean, true, this contains a majority, what seems to be a majority of John, but I mean, these are fragments of it. And while I agree that these fragments give a pretty good indication as to how those particular passages may have changed, like throughout those particular, that doesn't give us like the complete manuscript or complete snapshot of how to of those particular documents. So I don't. But all of this is besides the point of establishing historical reliability. This is just how they've been transmitted, like faithfully, I guess, over time without change. And we simply cannot know like what was originally there. We have some snapshots prior to that lead curtain, but or that lead wall, but we can't really know exactly what was there. But that's not even the core.
Well, when you have 5,898 manuscripts and they're 85% in agreement with each other, then that means 85% of it, you know exactly what was said. The statistical odds of having 85% in agreement, you know 85% what is agreement. And then when you take the other 15%, and the vast majority of those, 90% of that 15%, is just punctuations, inverted words, Jesus or Christ Jesus, a misspelled word, or it's even considered a textual variant if the word is spelled differently 150 years later, but it's still a different spelling. Even just like we have words that are spelled differently from 1890 to the time we use them today, there's maybe one word or one letter different, or there's a European spelling, or there's an American spelling. The same thing there. We count that as a textual variant, which we count as an error in the manuscripts because a word is spelled differently 200 years later, even though it's the same word, it's just a different spelling that they used at that particular time. So 85% of agreement and 90% of the 15% is insignificant, means nothing, and we know exactly what the correction is, solidly so. And of the last little small percentage that is significant, there's only 10 variant units that we have a very difficult time in determining what the original is. So when you say we don't know what the original is, I would beg to differ.
Hold on. Would you consider Mark 141 to be in that little sliver?
Mark 141? Yeah, there's thousands of variants, so it'd be hard for me to point out. Let me go look at Mark 141 for you, okay? You want me to look it up real quick?
Well, sure. It's where Jesus comes and where he's met by a leper, and in one particular variant, he meets him with pity, or he shows him pity or compassion, and then another one it says that Jesus gets angry. But while most of the Greek versions of it has him showing pity, the actual earliest versions of it that we have, being the the Codex Vitae that's supported by 3 Latin texts seems to be Jesus getting angry. All current texts right now say that he shows compassion, but
apologize, but actually the information that you're giving is not accurate. Okay, let me put it this way. The variant reading where it says, being compassionate, he stretched out his hand and touched the man, that reading there is supported by, first of all, manuscripts are not counted, they're weighed. If the majority was the truth, we'd all be Catholic or Muslims, right? So the majority doesn't mean that you're actually right, because if somebody copies something wrong and another 2,000 people copy that wrong answer, well, then it's still wrong. So the majority.
Yeah, but
so
then
we
you just
weigh
make an argument that the more text that we have, that means most likely right.
The more manuscripts that you have is not the same thing as arguing for what is an original reading. I'm saying the more manuscripts that you have, the more chances of all the variants being there, and there's no other variant. So the more that you have, that argument's an apple and orange from the other. But just dealing with your Mark 141 here, we weigh manuscripts. So there are manuscripts, and even airmen would agree with this. We don't count manuscripts, we weigh manuscripts. One manuscript might be more valuable than another because it's proven that the scribe was a professional scribe. He copied meticulously. He made almost next to no errors. And it's just on. There's evidence to show that this manuscript will weigh more in evaluation than others. And the ones that we have for the reading, being compassionate, he stretched out his hand and touched us, we have the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, we have the Washingtonus, we have bukus of manuscripts. And these are all really weighty manuscripts. For the variant and being angry, we have the D text that you're referring to, the Beze that you're referring to, and one old Latin gospel from the 4th century. So it's kind of like you can't put a Chevette up against a Corvette and say the Chevette is better than the Corvette. You know, that is Chevette evidence there. And those two manuscripts are not really that weighty. Now, I will give you that this old Latin manuscript hold on. Is.
Sorry. Okay. You said that it's only supported by one Latin manuscript, but it's actually supported by 3 Latin manuscripts, and this is Bart Ehrman's argument for this particular passage.
Well, yeah. Okay. So even if it's supported by 3 Latin manuscripts, which I'm showing one here in the source I'm looking at, but I'm not looking at the Nassau Allen 28, which would give me all of the sources. When you look at a textual commentary, they're going to give you the most prominent things that are of it, because in some instances where you have MAJ in a textual commentary, that means majority. So that would mean like 2,000 Byzantine manuscripts support a particular reading, and if we had to write out all of those manuscripts for particular things, you can see where that problem would come through. So you just write majority. All right, so this source here I'm using, it's only listing one Latin manuscript. But if verse 3, then that's fine. That still does not overrule the evidence, the textual evidence for the other one. The other one is monumental, mountainous. And if this is in Ehrman's book, then he's just straight out misleading, because one thing what I would suggest you do is Google Ehrman when he's talking to churchgoers or when he's talking to lay people, or look at Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, but yet go look at Bruce Metzger's The Text of the New Testament, which is co-authored with Ehrman, and you will see in the text of the New Testament he says one thing, but in Misquoting Jesus he says something different, and there's a reason he does that. The churchgoer, the common person, reads Misquoting Jesus. The text of the New Testament is an academic book that textual scholars read. He can't say the same thing that he says in the other because he knows they know. So you can't lie, you can't mislead, you can't misrepresent in front of people that have studied the same evidence to the level that you've studied the evidence, because you'll be looking like a fool. When he's standing in an audience and debating Daniel Wallace on stage, he doesn't, and he's talking to an audience of textual scholars, he doesn't try to fudge evidence. He said the truth of things. So that's the difference you're going to get from Ehrman. So in his Misquoting Jesus, if he's misrepresenting this evidence, the one at Mark 141 has a mountain of good manuscripts to support, and all Bible translations follow that reading. The other one has four manuscripts, 3 that you have from the Latin and the Bezae.
Okay. So, I mean, all of this has been on kind of textual stuff, but I'm kind of, would you mind if we kind of switch gears a little bit? Well, what was it first? What was the name of the book that Ehrman co-authored with, what was it, Metzger?
The Text of the New Testament with Bruce Metzger. And it's the 4th edition because that's when he joins. And then there's another one that he actually is the editor of, and there's a bunch of Bible textual scholars all throughout that writes many chapters. And it's also called the Text of the New Testament, but it's a longer title, and you'll see it when it's there too. It's like $250. So I don't know if you'd want to invest in that, but you can get the other one free if you could do Google PDF or something like it. It's actually free.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm just wondering, can you explain to me the difference in Matthew and Luke's birth narratives for Jesus, and which one do you think is the accurate portrayal of Jesus's birth?
Well, I think that you're coming at the birth narrative from 2 different perspectives. One's following one line of family, and one's following another line of family, and that's the difficulty with trying to pick. Like
I'm sorry, are you talking about the genealogy?
Oh, you talking about the genealogy? Oh, yeah, I thought you was talking about the genealogy.
No, I'm not talking about the genealogy. I'm talking about the narrative surrounding like Jesus's birth and what happens during, like what happens like surrounding his birth and everything like that.
Well, the Synoptic Gospels really are just telling the story from 3 different perspectives from the information that they have. It's like three different people that see a car wreck. You know, they're all going to give you the general, but something's going to stand out to another one. And the 3 different types of people. Matthew's a tax collector, so lots of times he's got or money values and other things that he has in his gospel. Luke's a physician, so he has many medical terms in his gospel. Through Peter, it's a fast-paced thing because of Peter. So it's different persons with different sets and different personality who's trying to convey different information. Everything that Matthew saw, the same thing that Peter saw. And Matthew was privy to, not the same thing that Peter was privy to. And Luke wasn't privy to any of it. So he had to act. If you read Luke 1 through, he had to literally go around, and as he tried on Peter, he had to interview people, search, look at historical, talk to Peter and Paul and other people as he traveled as a companion. People, he had many people to gather together to write his Gospels. Any differences in the Gospel, it's either going to be a textual error or it's going to be some kind of Bible difficulty. If I could for a minute,
I'm sorry, you kept cutting out. I thought that you were done. I'm sorry.
No. I'm done. I'm pretty much done. When we talk about difficulties, there are close to 2,000 to 3,000 Bible difficulties between the Old and New Testament, and there are some difficult textual evidence. So, if you pick one of those out, I mean, I could talk about Bible in a general sense, and if maybe you get lucky and pick one, because I have looked at hundreds upon hundreds of them, and I've written about dozens upon dozens of them. But to actually remember the details without having to go look at it, because they're not easily unresolved in some cases. Like you have to go look at Chronicles, you have to go look at 2 Kings, you have to go look at Genesis, genealogy. You have to. So there's a lot that's involved in unraveling a Bible difficulty. It's not as just flipping one and off. So if I don't hit it, I apologize.
Okay, no, that's fine. It's just that you say that the birth narratives are like different people looking at a car wreck, but I really don't understand how you can have that view, because what you have is Matthew, what he sees is a car wreck, and then somebody just starts killing a whole lot of babies, and then the car wreck victim then leaves for a different country. And then you go to Luke, and apparently this car wreck actually took place 10 years later, and it only happened when the census was going on in the United States, and they had to go back to their home city for whatever reason, and they had a car wreck, and then they just stayed around and wherever they had their car wreck at. So I mean, you understand how the vast difference between Matthew's narrative and Luke's narrative make it to where it's literally not just different perspectives. They're totally different stories. Matthew's story, he mirrors Moses' story from the Old Testament, in that, there's this murder of Jewish babies in order to try to kill this savior that's come, and then the savior baby is then expedited out of the area to Egypt in some form or another. With Moses, he's put in the basket and he's floated down the river, and he goes and he lives in the Egyptians, the emperor of the Pharaoh's home, essentially being sent off to Egypt. And Jesus is also likewise whisked away to live in Egypt for a long period of time. So, I mean, there's obvious parallels to Matthew's birth narrative to Moses, and then Luke's actually takes place 10 years later. So I'm just kind of wondering, how do you reconcile those?
No, it's the same. I don't know where you're getting the 10 years later thing. Jesus was born in about 1 BCE. Hello?
Well, I mean, can I explain the difference there?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, well, so basically, we get that Matthew's Jesus is born around 4 BCE, because that's when Herod died. So it would have had to have happened prior to that. And then we get Luke's Jesus being born around 6 AD, and that's due to when this census was supposed to have happened. The census didn't happen until 6 AD, so Jesus couldn't have been born before 6 AD.
No, there's 2 censuses. That's where the problem is. You haven't looked it up, but there are 2 censuses, and the person that's doing the census had the office 2 times. So that's number one. So in Luke, Jesus was born in 1 BCE. And then in Matthew, apologies, what was you saying about the beginning of Matthew again? As far as the chronology goes, all the eclipse or something?
Because Herod dies in 4 BCE.
Oh, yeah, Herod. The chronology on that is, see, the thing is when you look at the chronology, you got to look at the different people, because there's 2 or 3 different arguments on the chronology of Herod and when he died, and whether it's a recession year or this or that. So I'd have to go look at the details of the chronology. I can't remember the chronology offhand, but there are 2 or 3 different chronologies, and one can be selective in the one that they want to choose, which I can be selective in the one I want to choose too. But as far as the lunar eclipse, and as far as the taxes and Herod dying and all these things, there are 2 different accounts of that. Luke is telling of the coming down to Jerusalem, and then Matthew's telling what happened after they got to Jerusalem and then go down into Egypt. I mean, really, I don't see that they're complementing each other, not really contradicting each other. But if you hold that one, support at christianpublishers.org, If you want to send that one to me, I will send you the information specifically to your email that gives you the full information so that you can see what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Well, so you're trying to say that Quirinius was the governor of the area in 1 BCE?
Yes, he was governor 2 times. Yes, he was governor twice.
I have not, that does not seem to corroborate, what I've found. He was not a governor twice in there. So I mean, that's just simply nothing that I found in the scholarly work about it. And I've researched this particular topic pretty heavily.
Okay. Well, and that's fine, and it's okay that we disagree. And but I'll send you the information to show you that he was governor twice, and so therefore 1 BCE is actually the correct date. And I don't think that Herod is in 4 BCE. I think it's in 1 BCE. So I'll send you the information if you want. Okay. Right now we're at an impasse on this thing. I don't think we're going to get any further with it.
No, we're not. Sorry if it seemed like I was beating a dead horse.
No. That's okay. That's okay. Hey, I'm telling you, when I was, like I told you in our pre-discussion, that I was an atheist at one time, and when I was younger, and I mean, I literally hated God, even though I believed there was no God. I don't know how you can hate something that there's something you believe that didn't exist. But because of the pain and suffering I went through as a child, I really hated God. So, and I had questions when I ran into a minister or pastor. I mean, I beat them up one side down the other with questions all the time. And it was because I was angry. I wanted there to be a God. I wanted there to be a reason for what's the problem here, right? And that there's going to be a hope for the future. So the things that you're asking, I asked 1,000 times, and some of the people just didn't have answers, and they couldn't give you an answer or something like that. So I understand wanting to get at the answer. I mean, ask you just a quick question for you. One of the things that happened in the 19th century was you have Bible critics that they'll say something like, okay, so Belshazzar is not mentioned in theology, he's not mentioned in history. There's no existence of Belshazzar. Daniel just made him up. And they would make that argument and just beat the drum, and that was a happy argument for them until 10 years later, Belshazzar shows up in an inscription, and it explains he's a co-ruler with his father, and all the information is right there to support the historicity of Belshazzar. The thing is, the Bible critic never went back to that. And they were like, oh, oops, sorry, okay, maybe nothing. They drop it as though it never happened or they never raised it, and then they move on to Shalmaneser of Assyria and say, well, he never existed, he never, on and on and on. And then he comes up in an inscription and it shows that, oh, he actually did live, he did exist. And the same thing, they drop it. And they never bring it up again, and they just move on to something else. And the thing is what amount of information needs to be corroborated for you to tip the scale from 37% of seeing some trustworthiness in things to getting to 51%? So if a person we should never ask for absolute certainty, because there is no absolute certainty. The thing is, we need to look for what's reasonable, rational, and acceptable. And we need to be fair. According to the Iliad by Homer is considered by a few manuscripts that's dated hundreds of years later to be 95% accurate by secular historians. 95% accurate. But when we get to the New Testament, we don't apply the same standards to that. So my question is, if a person took the time and they gave you rational, reasonable, and really good answers to the Bible questions that you have, how many need to be answered before you can move over to 51% as things are possible?
Well, for me, the issue with the New Testament is more or less in the lack of historical sources that they themselves cite. So I guess you would have to provide me with evidence of, I guess, any historical source behind the New Testament writings is what you'd have to provide me. But I mean, just like with the examples that you listed, I really don't think that we should just accept at face value that certain people existed. Like
But how can they cite, how can they cite historical sources? Yeah, Belshazzar. How can they cite historical sources? I mean, when you think of the Apostle Paul writing 14 letters to congregations, the places and things that he refers to actually existed. But why would he, if I'm writing to the Ephesians and I'm talking to them about their lack of morality and I'm talking to them about their personal problems or marrying or homosexuality, why would he take the time to put a footnote in the manuscript that refers to some historical document? What would the historical document support for Paul's moral arguments to the Ephesians or the Colossians or the Galatians? What would be the purpose in putting an historical?
Well, so I mean that wasn't my argument actually. My argument actually. My argument in my argument, I said that Paul doesn't really discuss history, so we don't really have any kind of we don't get any, I guess, historical information other than minor things like, that Peter existed and he was a pretty big prominent figure in the church. James the Pillar, he also mentions in there. So I like, as far as establishing the historicity of the meat of the New Testament being like things about Jesus's past and history in general, to me that's not supported historically, and that's because the Gospels, they don't cite historical information. They only cite scriptural sources as where they get their information from. So to me, the fact that they are completely separated from any kind of historical source seems to indicate to me that they're not writing historical narratives or doing anything that a normal historian would do. Even in Luke, in the very first part,
they're writing a biography about the history and the life of Jesus Christ. Right? I mean, they mention geographically everything that they mention is true, right? Geographically?
No.
Okay, all right. Well, geography, they mention dozens upon dozens of cities, towns, and regions. There's nothing.
Well, hold on, let me clarify real quick, because I said no, but I mean it's a very nuanced no, because for instance, like Luke, he gets a lot of geography wrong in his. Mark gets a lot of geography wrong in his. It's not that these places didn't exist; it's more or less like exact positioning and everything like that. As far as not knowing geography, Jerusalem existed. Sure, but that doesn't give me any kind of indication as to whether or not the events that have been claimed to have happened there actually happened.
Oh, so you want, okay, I think I follow you now. Apologies. Maybe not, but we'll see. So what you're wanting is the historical things that they mention within the Gospels, or maybe the historical things that's mentioned in the book of Acts by Luke. You want them also to be corroborated in the other history books by other historians of some way, shape, or form, or something like that. But I would just venture to say that. Okay, go ahead.
Well, not necessarily. That's not necessarily. I mean, that would also be awesome. That would provide really strong evidence that the events that occurred in the Gospels and other parts of the New Testament actually happened. That would be really good indication. But what I'm actually talking about are the sources that informed the Gospels.
The sources that inform the Gospels are the personal experiences of the people telling the Gospels. There's no reason to cite another's. Huh?
I'm sorry for interrupting you. The Gospel writers were not eyewitnesses. Okay. And the people that are attributed to the Gospels in their titles are not the ones that actually wrote the Gospels.
Yeah, that's the claim, but the problem we face with that is that the second century authors all refer to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors of the Gospels, And also the manuscripts P66 and P75 that we have, which date within decades of the actual writings, one of them within 30 to 40 years of the actual writings of the Gospel of John. They have the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke right before it and at the end of the Gospel. So all the manuscripts that we have that come after that time period, right after that, have the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of John right there in the manuscripts. If there was some argument about who did not write the Gospels, then you would see a diversity of things. You would see somebody other than those people also be written in some of these manuscripts. If it was the case that other people wrote these, then you would see other people also being written in those manuscripts, but it's consistent with everything all the way through. So not only do the people and the church fathers, dozens of church fathers write about it and name these people as the authors of the Gospels, but also the manuscripts themselves that are within decades of the Gospels also have them named in the front of the Gospel. And it's true that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not say like Paul did, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. They don't write and say, Mark, a disciple of Jesus Christ. But it's in the manuscripts within decades. And historically, there's no other thing that's ever mentioned as a potential other author. So
all of that is also explained with the Gospels being unnamed. It was first reported by, I believe, I think Papias is the earliest church father that actually assigned them names. But by the time in the 2nd century that names would have been attributed to them, they had already been long in circulation. And so applying the title names to these unnamed Gospels, I think perfectly explains the situation that we have too. I find it to be kind of purely speculative to suggest that people would have just taken the Gospel or like Mark's Gospel before it got its name. I think it's highly speculative to just say, oh, well, many other people would have just written their names on it. I really don't think that would be the case, because they anonymously wrote the Gospel first, and then Papias assigned the names to them. At least that's what we have evidence to suggest.
No, Papias didn't assign the names to them. Papias just simply named the people that wrote the Gospels. That's the information. You have early writers from 90 all the way up, and Papias and Polycarp were both disciples of the Apostle John. So they have actual...
Can you cite where they claim that?
I'd have to send that to you, really. I mean, yeah.
I can put that in the...
It's common knowledge that both Papias and Polycarp were disciples of Jesus Christ. But even so, their lives overlap into the 1st century, into the 2nd century. So they were right there. Clement of Rome wrote his document in the late 1st century or at the very beginning of the 2nd century. So it's very known that who was the authors of the Gospels. Everybody knew who the authors of the Gospel. 1 million Christians, as I told you, at that time period. Everybody you have the authors all mentioning who they are. Matthew is accepted as the number one gospel. It's the number one referred to, and not Mark, because Mark was not first. And you have the manuscripts that are just as early who have the names at the manuscript. So it's like people are wanting to actually set aside and discount the actual historical evidence that's right there that gives us the information who the gospel writers were, to then have speculation as to what could be, might be, should be. It just seems unfair that we want to set aside. I mean, you have hard evidence from dozens of people and the manuscripts as to who the authors of the gospel were. And yet people want to set that aside for what might be, could be, should be. It just seems unfair.
So the consensus of historical scholars, New Testament scholars, and all that put Mark being written after 70 A.D. and Mark was the first one to be written. So I'm kind of curious, what makes you think that Mark wasn't the first one to be written?
Because Matthew was the first one to be written, and then Luke, and then Mark, and that's another long discussion. Matthew early on was accepted as the first gospel, as the primary gospel, not Mark. Mark is seldom mentioned in comparison to Matthew. I mean, the whole of Christianity in the first 2 centuries saw it that way, and nobody ever questioned it for 1,500 years. And modern scholarship, let's talk about modern scholarship. 90% of the modern day scholars have hung themselves on higher criticism, skepticism, doubt, uncertainty. I mean, that is their plug. That is their thing. They have caused more damage to the Bible. From the German scholars of the 1800s up until the present, they have caused more damage to the trustworthiness of the Bible, the trustworthiness of Christianity, with their higher criticism, biblical criticism, than anybody else. And all of the seminaries have gone that way. They are all speculative, like the Q document. Everybody says that the Q document has done this, and the Q document has done that, and the Q document refer to the Q document. But there's a problem. There's no Q document. There's absolutely no Q document. There's no document called the Q document. There's no reference from the church fathers that says anything Q document. So how can you even begin to a Q doc? Yes, the Gospels were oral a decade or so before Matthew penned his Gospel, but that was an oral. So there's no Q document.
Well, I agree about the Q document, weirdly enough, that I don't think that anybody could discern Q from Mark, but I think that's where we're going to disagree, because there's substantial and pervasive evidence that shows that Mark was written after 70 AD, and then Matthew was written next, who copied pretty much all of Mark, and then Luke used both Matthew and Mark to write his gospel, as well as other historians of the time like Josephus. He also used Homer's Odyssey and Iliad. So I mean, there's just there's not a lot to the Gospels that really say anybody, I would think, that they are based on historical accounts.
There's no literary dependency between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic Gospels. There's no literary dependency. Let me explain how I can say that. Excuse me. There are 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament. There are 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament. There are only 5,394 total unique words in the Greek New Testament. There are words that are basic, that are not relevant to literary dependency. Think about it. 138,000 words, and there are only 5,394 that are actually unique words. The definite article, the, occurs 20,000 times in the New Testament. The conjunction and occurs 10,000 times in the New Testament. He, she, it, and I occurs 7,300 times in the New Testament. The conjunction but occurs 2,800 times in the New Testament. I am occurs 2,500 times in the New Testament. The second personal pronoun you occurs 2,900 times in the New Testament. I, the personal pronoun I say, is 2,004. 20,000, 10,000, 7,000, 2,800, 2,900, 2,004. All those up together. And these were also considered in that literary uniqueness that are supposed to be tied together to make them the synoptic Gospels. And that's the reason that you take all of that away, and then the percentage of likeness down to next to 5% agreement. It's just so.
Well, yeah, but I mean, there's verbatim like copies of like entire sections of Mark. So, I mean, it kind of seems like a very specially pleading argument that you've got there.
No, there's some unique words that are in there that are the same, but the unique words are the limited words that are in the New Testament. So you might have a whole 10 verses that sound like it, look like it's the same, but when you put in the light and then you look, they're not the same. So, but there are a lot of them that are the same. And then you see it, but, I am, and the, and all those, you mark those out. And then out of those 150, 250 you've got there, you might have 8 or 10 words in the whole thing that are uniquely count. Once you take out all of those words that recur, because the is 20,000 before everything, the is using the word. So when you remove all of that stuff, you might have 10, 15 unique words that are the same throughout, and them unique words are there for, because it's two people trying to tell you the same thing. Car crash might be in the thing that the people saw. Car crash, car crash, car crash. All three use car crash. But all three also use am, but, he, or, she, is, am, I. Those basic words that everybody uses. So really, once you start removing things, then the likeness is not as like as one thinks. And that's another thing. Etta Linnemann, a German scholar, if you read her, who was under Rudolf Bultmann, the guy that makes these kinds of arguments as a professor, she left company with him because she found things that he was saying just not to be true. And she has 3 books on this. Etta Linnemann, E-T-A Linnemann. If you look her up, she'll
Okay.
give you a lot of insight.
I mean, I'm kind of curious. So you think that when the Gospels were written, they had titles that indicated their authorship? Is that a correct thing to say?
I don't know. I can't know because I don't have the originals. But I say that everybody. What happened is this. All right. First, you had an oral gospel going on, and we're not an oral society that can remember everything verbatim. It's a whole. If you're not a part of an oral society where people can recite the whole Psalms 119 verbatim all the way through, never missing a word, and probably say it halfway back 1 and 2. If you're not a part of that society, then you really can't understand how they have the capacity to be able to do that. So the oral gospel was passed on for a time, but then the gospel authors began to come to the realization that, over time, this could get lost or this could get misconstrued. So they decided to write their gospels. And there was no need to put their names on it if they didn't put their names on it. But then the same thing happened when you get into the 2nd century. Okay? Maybe there was a worry or a concern that, hey, so much time passes, we should probably write this. So when they started to put the name on the top of the gospels, I don't know. And it's the same thing with putting the nomina sacra, the sacred names in the manuscripts. All of a sudden, these abbreviations in the 2nd century just show up, and all of a sudden somebody decided, because they're all over from Rome clear down to Alexandria, manuscripts. And so you have this consistency of something that just shows up on the scene. So when they put it in there, I don't know, but it's early on. And it's during a time period when everybody's still alive. And people that would have had and known access to the Apostle John. And it's in the manuscripts. It's the church fathers, all the church fathers, the apologists, they all say the same thing. What's the statistical odds? Nobody messes up and puts Frank in there anywhere. Frank writing Mark is not put in there anywhere. Nobody slips up and messes up and puts some kind of accidental other name in there. Nobody ever does it. Out of all the church fathers that talk about it, nobody does it. No manuscript does it. They're all consistently the same with what the 1st century had.
But you can't say that. You don't, because you don't have any kind of documentation whatsoever previous to the 2nd century that indicates who wrote these documents. I mean, nowhere in Mark does it say Mark wrote.
What do you have for the other side? What documents do you have that it was somebody else?
Well, my position is that they were anonymously written, in that We don't know who
What
wrote
documents
them.
do you have? What documents do you have that somebody else wrote them? You said somebody else wrote them.
Well, because prior to Papias just outright saying, "Oh, Mark wrote this with," and by the way, Papias does not have any connection to any of the supposed disciples of Jesus. No, there's no indication that Polycarp or Irenaeus, either of them, were actually disciples of the disciple John.
I think
the
it's
apostle
Irenaeus
John.
or Tertullian, one of them two mentioned that Papias was a disciple of Jesus Christ, or maybe it was
Papias?
no, Tertullian
Sorry.
or Athens.
No, but my point is that the people that you say were disciples of the apostle John, there's no citation that you could provide me where those specific people make that claim. It is later people who are claiming that they were.
There's the later church fathers name them as being disciples who are within that generation. So that's where the information comes from.
Yeah,
but you keep asking for historical information.
Sorry.
No,
well, I was just going to say, if I claim that Mark that lives across from me was a disciple of Jesus, I mean, that doesn't mean that he's actually a disciple of Jesus. Or let's put this in a more realistic way. If I claim that the guy across from me, Mark, is the president of the local, coalition of churches, does that make him the president of the local coalition of churches?
It does not make him also. It does not make him also, because you're arguing from silence. And you're also not giving, you want history, then a person gives you history, and then you reject the history. And then also a person asks you for support because you said, no, none of them people that's named in the Gospels wrote the Gospels. Other people wrote the Gospels. And I said, historical manuscripts for that support, and you don't have the historical manuscripts for that support. It's like you're asking for us to give support, and we give bunches of support, and then you reject that support, but then you don't have nothing for your support because you're arguing from silence, because you have nothing to put out there to support your proposition.
No, but if I don't have any evidence to say that something was the case, regardless of whether or not you consider it a fallacious use of the argument from silence, you don't have any evidence that that's the case.
We do.
You don't have any direct evidence from either of the people that you say were disciples of the apostle.
Direct evidence. You can put a person on death row today for circumstantial evidence. No gun, no body. You can put a person on death row. Once you stack up enough circumstantial evidence, that person gets put in the electric chair. So if you can do that with executing another human being, then certainly the circumstantial evidence that we have that isn't absolutely direct evidence, but it's a mountain of circumstantial evidence, we have that. But then the other side has none, has no evidence for their argument that the other people other than the supposed gospel writers wrote the gospel. There's no evidence for that, but the circumstantial evidence we have is enough for us to be able to feel comfortable with our position and our view.
All right, that concludes our discussion. Great discussion. Appreciate you both. So now we're going to transition to our 5-minute closings, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So everyone out there who's watching right now, get your questions in. Make sure you put at the Gospel Truth, then who the question is for, followed by the question, so it'll stand out and I know what are questions and what are not questions. It's very helpful to get those questions quick. So with that said, Mr. John Gleason, you got it for your 5-minute closing.
Okay. Well, for me personally, I feel like I laid out a pretty solid argument today for the for how the New Testament's unreliable. First, we started off with textual reliability, and I understand Edward and his points that he brought up about this, but I still feel like even these supposed minor errors that we know occurred, or purposeful or deliberate changes to the Bibles that we do have, I believe that this still indicates that there's no way that we can really judge exactly how many errors were happening, but we do know that it was at least more than the errors that happened after the 4th century. So we cannot really be all that sure that the Gospels that we have today, or the information in the New Testament that we have today, was originally written down back then. We do have those papyri that he talked about that give us snapshots. That's how we know certain things. Like he mentioned Papyrus 66. That's how we know that the Jesus drawing line in the sand, telling people to he who is without sin be the first to cast the stone. That was not originally in John, and Papyrus 66 is how we know that. But I also mentioned a comparative situation with the ending of Mark. We don't know how Mark ended originally. It may have just ended at 16:8. It could have continued on with some other kind of ending that's now lost to time. So we do have certain glimpses behind this lead wall, but as far as knowing exactly what was originally written down, there's no way that we'll ever be able to know that. And then what I covered was how the New Testament in general is not reliable historically. And that's through mentioning several different points at which the New Testament disagrees with actual history. Like there was supposedly an earthquake when Jesus died. That's not recorded anywhere. I have a feeling that Edward would say that this is just an argument from silence, but the argument from silence is only fallacious if there's a reason for people to have mentioned it. So like a giant earthquake that struck Judea, there were several historians that wrote about natural occurrences that happened during that time. With the eclipse, we can do basic math and turn back the clock and know if there was a eclipse that went through Judea at the time. And we just don't have any kind of evidence for that, let alone a 3-hour eclipse. The whole idea that the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke don't contradict each other is, I would say, kind of a ridiculous claim, because they are obviously 10 years apart. I don't think that the census in 1 BC really took place under Quirinius, as the Luke tells us that when Jesus was born. So I'm still definitely convinced that those two accounts are 10 years apart, and I might say that most historians also agree with that. Well, experts in this field being New Testament scholars and all that. That's not indicative that it is true or anything. I'm just saying that the arguments that support the consensus in this particular situation seem to actually support the consensus. And I covered many different problems with New Testament history, historical information. And finally, the thing that really kind of gets me is still the utter lack of historical sources that were used for the Gospels, because Paul doesn't really talk about any kind of history surrounding any of the Gospel history. And these Gospels, since they don't cite any kind of historical source for their information, and they're definitely not written by eyewitnesses, it seems highly unlikely that they would communicate historical information in general that actually map to history. So thank you everybody for watching today. I really appreciated this exchange, and I guess I'll hand it over to Edward.
All right, Edward, you got it for 5 minutes, man.
Okay, returning to the Greek New Testament manuscripts, we have 5,898 Greek New Testament manuscripts that date from 100 CE all the way up until the time of the printing press in 1455. Those manuscripts are 85% in agreement. So when we say we don't know what the original says, We know 85% what the original says, absolutely for certain. There's no doubt, no question. And then as far as the textual variants that are in there, 90% of those, 15% are insignificant. They're insignificant. They mean nothing. Whether the author said Jesus Christ did this or Christ Jesus did this, or there's a spelling difference that took place over a 200-year period, these are insignificant. And we know absolutely without any shadow of a doubt which one was the original reading. You know, if you're reading along in a document and somebody writes one word and they misspell that word and you clearly know English well, you can tell, well, that word doesn't belong there. And then you have other great manuscripts that support the other reading, then it's not that hard to determine the original. As far as the eclipses go, there was an eclipse on March 11th, 4 BCE, all right? And so because of this, some have concluded that the eclipse was referred to by Josephus. But on the other hand, there was a total eclipse of the moon on 1 BCE, about 3 months before the Passover. And the one in 4 BCE was only a partial eclipse. So in 1 BCE, you have a total eclipse that took place. And in 4 BCE, you have a partial eclipse that took place. And as far as the, let's see, I'm trying to think of the other things that he brought up. Herod the Great and the other things, it's the same kind of thing. You have two different types of historical information, that can be pointed to. You do have 2 eclipses here. Which one is he referring to? And the census to come down, there was 2 different censuses. There was one in 6 and there was one in 1 BCE. So we have what we have here is people that want to argue there's no historical information for this or no historical information for that. And then we mention historical information and we mention other historical information, then they dismiss that out of hand as being relevant or adding anything to the argument. And then at the same time, you say, well, where's your historical information for the other? And then they have no historical information for what they want to offer. And I would say the New Testament books, there's no reason. They're not. You're trying to take a modern day thesis paper, a PhD document that has 175 footnotes and 20 pages, and say that that's how New Testament authors should write. That's not how anybody wrote at that time period. That nobody put footnotes in, nobody put these kinds of references in that's being expected from the Gospels. And there was no reason to put any kind of a historical citation. And as far as an earthquake in the book of Matthew, he says it was a great earthquake. Well, it's an earthquake in Judea. Judea is not that big of an area. That would be like having an earthquake in Columbus, Ohio. And then we consider the United States country, how big it is. Columbus, Ohio is, Franklin County is what? It's not that big. So if they have a 4.2 earthquake, it isn't like people in California are going to be talking about that 4.2 earthquake. And why would the Roman historian Tacitus write about a small earthquake or even a great earthquake in Judea in his history of the Roman Empire? Why would Josephus write about an earthquake? It didn't impact anything in the historical setting, the historical situation. So, not everybody writes about something because it's unmentioned. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Because it's unexplained, it doesn't mean that it can't be explained. Maybe we lack information at the time, or maybe we lack information. That's my time, I think.
All right. Thank you both for the closing remarks. So now we're going to transition to Q&A from the audience. We have a whole bunch of questions for you guys, and I hope you guys are ready to tackle these guys. So let's get into it. All right. Got to start with my super chat. You see it pop up on the bottom of the screen if it wants to behave. And let me try that again. Doesn't want to behave, so I'll just read it. Thank you for the super chat. Stupid energy. I said, who wrote the book of Hebrews? Mr. Edward, you want to answer that, tackle that one? Who wrote the book of Hebrews?
The Apostle Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. It was accepted, he's not named in there, but he was accepted as the author in the first century, in the second century, third century. It is until modern times that, other people came up with the idea of Luke or Barnabas or other people writing the book of Hebrews. The style certainly matches the Apostle Paul. The subject matter is a little bit different because his audience is a little bit different. But the overwhelming evidence is that the Apostle Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. I actually have a whole book on that, so if you want to Google that, you can take a look.
If I could add in, New Testament scholars and historians and textual critics have actually pegged Hebrews as not being written by Paul. So I would go with that because their arguments seem more compelling than assuming Paul wrote it because of secondary information. With no primary indication that Paul wrote it, I think that it's unlikely that he did.
All right, next question here. This is for you, John. Question for GE. Why do you criticize ancient biblical accounts with a persistent lens? Persistent lens.
Well, I think that's presentists, and that's the idea that we're misapplying the historical method to ancient sources. But I really don't understand why people would claim that just having good historiography is somehow violating, some kind of proof for evidence. I'm just using a basic historiography method of how we date sources and how sources are considered to be more valuable than other sources. So I don't understand why you would think that I'm using a presentist. I'm not expecting like Polaroids or like pictures or anything like that. Just a quick, for instance, here about how I'm definitely not doing what you're claiming that I'm doing. Is the fact that in my argument, I said that just because the Gospels were written 20 years after Paul and 40 years after Jesus supposedly died, just because they were written that far does not necessarily mean that they can't hold some kind of historical information. What indicates that they don't have any kind of historical credence is the fact that they don't cite any kind of historical sources as their source of material. That's the problem with the New Testament Gospels. I know that Edward disagrees with me on this. I'm perfectly fine with that, but that is my issue with it, and I don't think that that's really a presentist or me importing modern standards onto ancient text.
All right. Any thoughts on that, Edward?
No. No, I got no thoughts.
All right. No thoughts. No thoughts. It's okay. All right. Let me see if I can get some for Edward. I wanted to try to get it even kill here. I think this one is for you, Edward. Let me get this one down. All right. It says, why is it hard to believe that the Gospels are historical fiction and have fact? For example, we know King David and Pilate existed, but totally different from what the Bible says.
Because they don't claim to be historical fiction. They claim to be narrative. They claim to be history. They claim to be expressing historical events that took place in a historical setting and historical places. There's nowhere in them. I mean, they even go into great detail. Luke is lines up every time he uses a parable to make it quite clear that he is a parable or an illustration, and is not meant to be taken literally. And as far as Luke goes, there's several world-renowned prominent historians, Rollins for one, that names Luke as one of the greatest historians that's ever lived because of his accuracy. And there's been a couple people that have literally taken what Luke wrote in the book of Acts and have traveled through and followed every stage and everything that he talks about, and everything pans out the way that he put it down. And I know John would disagree on that, but so that's just, a difference of an opinion. You can read the historians that argue against that and what they offer as their evidence, and you can read the historians that argue that Luke was a great historian, and you can argue as to why they say that, and then just weigh the evidence and make the determination for yourself.
So what I have to say about this is that I agree with Jane that, like, for instance, Pilate in the New Testament is quite radically different from the Pilate that we find in actual history. Like, as Josephus records, Pilate at one point in time had his soldiers dress up as Jews that were protesting, and he ordered all of them to be killed with a snap of his finger. And he didn't show any kind of hesitation or remorse for that. But yet when you get to the Gospels, what you find is a Pilate that's pacing back and forth trying to make a hard decision of whether or not to kill one Jew for something that the Jewish Sanhedrin was bullying him into, which seems to be quite contradictory to the actual Pilate that we find in history. So that's just one particular example of how Pilate it seems to be radically different in the Gospels compared to actual history.
If I could add a follow-up on that point right there, I would say that when you're talking about two different historical settings, you might have two different types of set of circumstances. The one setting might be a setting where you're just talking about regular old Jews that maybe he disregarded and thought were subhuman and didn't really care about. But in the other historical setting, you're talking about coming across a man that for 3.5 years has been traveling from Caesarea all the way down into Judea and performing miracle after miracle, raising people from the dead. Even when centurions were sent to arrest him, just a small conversation with him, and they were unable to bring him in. And so Pilate, in the presence of Jesus, had probably more of a conversation with Jesus than what we are given in the Gospels. Pilate's well aware of his miracles, well aware of his activities in the area, and so he might be more cautious in that set of circumstances. So you can't explain one bank robbery in Oklahoma and another bank robbery in Columbus, Ohio, and expect them same set of circumstances and situations, different people, different places. It's different, so that you might get a different outcome based on that. So that would be my argument against that.
Okay. Next question. I think this question is important when we're dealing with it's more of a statement than an actual question, but I would like both of you guys to interact with this. So this is from Atomic Apologetics. It says, it's concerning the New Testament, how the New Testament is more than 99.98% accurate. Question for you, Edward. How do we come to that conclusion that it is, in fact, 99.98% accurate concerning the New Testament? How do we get that conclusion?
So I'm sure he's referring to maybe the critical text, like the Nassau Island Greek text or the United Bible Society's Greek text, being reflective of the original. In other words, we have 99.98 or whatever percent of the original. Or if he's saying the accuracy, then he's referring to the original and the next. We have a restored text right now that I do believe is 99.99% accurate of the original text. So when we say that there's no contradictions, errors, or mistakes in the originals, that's what we're referring to, not some translation that might mistranslate or not some particular manuscript that might say something else. So I would agree with the person that we can say that because we have the evidence from the manuscripts to support that. And textual criticism is a long, deep, arduous subject, so it would take a lot of time to explain why that's so. But we have secular scholars have hardly any manuscripts to support what they say that their people from history said and did. And they all, not only do they have hardly any manuscripts, but the manuscripts are hundreds and hundreds of years removed, some of them 1,000 to 2,000 years removed. And so therefore they want to never call into doubt. They just say with absolute certainty what happened, what took place, who said what. On our end of the thing, we have 24,000 manuscripts, some of them dating within decades, and we have a whole boatload of information that's available to us to support that conclusion.
So John, so we have a mountain of textual evidence for the New Testament and the Old Testament, if we want to conglomerate it together, but obviously this is concerning the New Testament. We have a mountain of textual evidence to do textual critical work on the New Testament, and we come to the conclusion that it's a 99.98%. If we have this mountain of textual evidence, and there is more textual evidence than any other historical document that we have from antiquity, why not agree and say, hey, that 99.98% of accuracy is credible?
Well, I guess I would have to ask, like, for a citation on the idea that it is the most accurate, transmission of a document that we've ever had in history. I highly doubt that that's an accurate thing to say, but also I still go back to this lead wall that we have in the 4th century. I get that we have some papyri that exist, that we found that exist prior to that, but that only gives us small little snippets, very, very short glimpses into, into what's behind that lead wall. But ultimately, we cannot absolutely know what was originally written. You still, unless you can find a mid-2nd century codex that's floating around out there somewhere, I really doubt that we would ever find out what was actually originally written down. But I mean, even then, that only gets us to when the New Testament books were actually sort of packaged together in sort of a New Testament form, because that was formed in the mid-2nd century. Even then, we still wouldn't know prior to that how much the text had changed. So I hope that we do discover that kind of physical evidence one day, because I'm looking to get at the truth of it. And I'm not necessarily biased in the sense that I don't want it to be true or something like that. I'm just going where the evidence leads. And where the evidence leads is that we simply cannot have like a percentage on how accurate it is, just because we are just simply blind to the original versions of the documents.
But Bart Ehrman, the person you cited most often, supports the accuracy. He doesn't deny the accuracy. He lets you know what the textual variants are, but he doesn't deny the level of accuracy of the original New Testament. And you keep pointing to the papyri as though they're scraps and fragments like the size of your hand. We're talking about manuscripts with folios of pages upon pages. You put those 140 papyri together, and you have the whole New Testament a couple times over. So you have the whole New Testament before the brick wall of your 4th century that's sitting right there. And then, again, you're ignoring the 85% that's in total agreement of all 5,898 manuscripts. You can't ignore the fact that 85% we know absolute with a certainty that what was in the original, because they're the same in all of the manuscripts. So I think that there's some setting aside of facts and not considering all of the information.
I mean, if we consider that one of the leading atheist skeptics, we mentioned Dr. Bart Ehrman, argues that it is, he agrees with the accuracy. Does that not help the Christian argument? Would you say that helps the Christian argument, Mr. John?
Well, so, I mean, I really need to look up the citation on Bart Ehrman mentioning this, which it might be in misquoting Jesus. I'm not saying, well, I didn't ultimately say, of course, how much of it how much of a percentage of it is accurately translated. I said that I ultimately don't know because we have that lead wall. So I made no speculation on how much of the New Testament was actually transmitted accurately. I didn't say that it was poorly transmitted or anything like that. But I would say that even if it ultimately, if I give you that it is 99.98% accurate to what was originally written down, that's why in my opening statement, I also covered the fact that these sources don't have any kind of historical bearing. They don't have any kind of historical sources associated to them. So regardless of how they were transmitted, as we know them to exist now, regardless of how accurate they are, they still suffer from those fatal flaws that I mentioned. The big one being that they're not actually connected to any kind of historical source to support their writings.
Okay. Edward, I have one more question for you. So concerning the New Testament, and you pointed out earlier in your opening statement, I believe, that we have several verses that were sort of, or like the verse concerning the Trinity, that was a side note and got added into the text by translators or people who copied the text. Like, as somebody who might be a skeptic, somebody who might not agree, how do they deal with issues of that nature when it comes to the accuracy of the New Testament, and when they come across areas where obviously a verse is not supposed to be there, but it's there, it's treated as scripture,
as though it's original.
Yep.
Yeah, that's only in the King James version that it's in the 1 John 5:7 is there. All modern Bible translations don't have that Trinitarian verse. In 1 Timothy 3:16, where it says in the King James version, God was made manifest in the flesh. In all the other modern translation, it says He was manifest in the flesh. So these textual errors shouldn't be disheartening. I mean, just like when Adam and Eve were perfect and they sinned and they left the garden, God left them on their own in order to be able to learn the object lesson of sin and suffering. God gave us the inspired record perfectly as it was, but He allowed imperfect humans to do the copying. And He also said that it would be preserved, but He didn't say it would be miraculously preserved. He said it would be preserved. It's been preserved through restoration. You have a 1,400-year period where imperfect humans copied the manuscripts. A lot of professional scribes did the copying. So we have a lot of it that is original, and we know what it says. But you do have 400,000 copyist errors in all of those manuscripts. But a lot of things that Muslims and other people bring up or fail to bring up is the other 500 years. You have hundreds of textual scholars that have worked their entire lives. And these are people like heart surgeons. I mean, they dig through manuscripts and they dig through how things are written, every microscopic thing that you can think about, and they give their entire days, their entire lives to the restoration of the New Testament text. And these are some of the smartest men in the world when it comes to these types of subject areas. And so we have that 500 years of restoration period, which is usually not mentioned, where textual scholars have given so much in order to give us the exact text that we have today that is a reflection of the original. So I wouldn't be disheartened. The problem is when you read a Bart Ehrman book misquoting Jesus, you also need to read the other side's book. You need to see what both people are saying. And then you need to read more than his lay books that are written by him for common people to read that don't know textual criticism, because he presents one thing here, and then over in his other academic-sounding literature, he presents something entirely different or says something entirely different. So you need to see that he's being a little devious in what he's saying and misleading and misrepresenting. So I wouldn't be disheartened by the fact that there's so many textual errors, because we have the manuscripts, we know what is 85% was original, we have corrected the other 15%. So there's not really a problem or a thing to be worried about. And I have a book on those 400,000 text. I mean, I've written 140 books, and I have 6 of them on textual criticism. But you don't even need to just read my books. Read Wallace's books, Daniel Wallace's books, Philip Comfort's books, and you will see the actual history of from the moment the books were written all the way up to the present time. exactly how they came down to us, and it will rebuild your faith in the New Testament text.
All right. And we have two more questions here. This was for you, John. All right, Gospel Truth question for GE. Are you familiar with all the bibliographical test scholars use to examine manuscript reliability?
Sorry, it's a little hard for me to read until it pops up on the screen on YouTube. Could you repeat what the question is?
It says, are you familiar with all the bibliographical tests scholars use to examine manuscript evidence?
Well, all I know, I mean, obviously, I'm not an expert in this particular field, right? If you want expert analysis of it, I suggest reading the experts like Bart Ehrman, Bert Metzger, all of them. I don't mean to portray myself as an expert. I believe I even said that in my argument that I'm not. But regardless of that, I do understand the method in which Bart Ehrman comes to it. I'm not exactly sure what you mean with bibliographical tests that scholars use to examine manuscript reliability. I do understand the basic historiographical method of dating sources and whether or not a source can be used as a primary source and whether or not that source actually stands up to other secular history or secular history in this case, or is corroborated by other history. So I'm not exactly sure what they mean by bibliographical test. I don't know if maybe Edward has some kind of insight into this, but I would just say that I understand how to properly do historiography and evaluating what most likely happened or how accurate a source could be.
Well, Ehrman in his Misquoting Jesus really doesn't go into any textual criticism, rules and principles of how to establish an original reading. He just gives you the original, he gives you what the two different readings are and talks about how they're so complicated and talks about how, they add to the inferiority of the New Testament text. But he doesn't give you the principles behind New Testament textual criticism. I mean, you got principles from Griesbach in the 1600s. You got Westcott and Orr's principles. These are rules and principles that people follow in order to determine what is an original reading. Like the shorter reading would be this if it's that, or the longer reading, the harder reading is preferred. Then you got scribal habits and internal evidence. And so there's rules and principles, and it's a long list of rules. Pretty much everybody agrees on the types of rules, if this is what the person's talking about, in order to establish the original reading. But Ehrman doesn't go into those kinds of things in his book because he's just giving you a general overview. He wants to give you, 30% water and 70% poison and tell you that you've got a glass of water. That's what he tries to do in his book. He misinforms you as much as he informs you in Misquoting Jesus. You will actually, and I'm not trying to be unfair to the man, you will learn a lot about textual criticism within his book about textual criticism, Misquoting Jesus. But you're also going to be given misinformation many times too. And if you have no knowledge of the subject matter, then how are you to determine what you're being given is true and what is not true, what is misinformation, what is misleading, what's he keeping out in order to have you draw a certain conclusion, things like that. If you really want to have a good understanding of New Testament textual criticism, then I would read Ehrman and Metzger's text of the New Testament, but I would also read every book you can get your hand on of Philip Comfort. He's one of the best scholars for giving us the insights from A to Z.
All right. And this is the final question. This is for you, Mr. G.E., John Gleason. Kind of small, so I'll read it. It says, if the amount of attestation we have for the New Testament isn't enough to consider it reliable, How can we consider any other historical document for which we have few copies produced long after the originals as reliable? This sort of hits on the same question I had earlier in the Q&A. So if you can rehash that one real quick.
Well, so I guess I would need, I guess an instance of what you're talking about here, which I know that's not exactly conducive for this kind of environment that we're in. But I mean, as far as a source having few copies or something, what I could point to is Alexander the Great. We actually have our best biographical information about Alexander the Great being written 500 years after he was alive. And the reason why we can actually trust this source is because they cite historical information that was available to them at the time, but is no longer available now. Most notably, two of Alexander the Great's generals. We have that. So as far as having few copies produced long after the originals, I mean, I don't think the amount of copies is necessarily all that important to whether or not something is true. As far as the knowing what is changed in those, like textual reliability and stuff like that, I think that you would have a less clear picture of how that document possibly changed. But I guess I don't understand the importance of having many copies versus just a few copies, other than wanting to know what the changes look like.
Well, the thing that the guy is referring to is the secular historians and secular writers. Homer's Iliad, writing was completed in 800 BCE. The earliest manuscripts come from the 3rd century. That's 500 years later. Herodotus' history, 480 to 425, the writing was completed. And it isn't until 10th century CE that we have manuscripts. That's 1,305 years later. Then you have Sophocles' plays. That's in 3rd century BCE. We only have 100 manuscripts on that. That's 100. That's only 100 years removed. Thucydides, who's considered a pretty good historian, his writings were completed in 460, 3rd century BC, the earliest manuscripts, 200 years later. But some of these authors, be it Caesar, Livy, Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, you're talking about 950 years removed, another one 750. The New Testament manuscripts, we have 5,898 manuscripts, and the years removed from the manuscripts is just decades, And the thing that you mentioned about Alexander the Great and the information coming from 500 years later, that's the reason the person has to cite so much historical information, is because he's 500 years removed, writing about an incident 500 years earlier. So he's going to refer to other things that's maybe historically related to what you're talking about. But when you're talking about Matthew writing in 45 to 50 CE about what Jesus did in 33 CE, some 15 years earlier, there's no reason to have a lot of these historical references that you're desiring, because everybody's well aware, because they were alive at the time. They don't really need all of these historical references that you're referring to. The person writing 500 years after Alexander the Great, he has to put those things in there, if those things are in there, in order to support what he's saying to be validity of 500 years earlier.
So I would totally disagree with this and everything that you just said. First, you kind of did an analogy, false analogy fallacy, because if we were to compare those particular writings with the situation with the New Testament Gospels, you would have to say at least 200 to 300 years for the Gospels, because that's when we have our first full and complete Codex is in the 4th century. Hold on. I'll let you talk. Hold on. And then to further put it into context, the earliest edition of Eusebius that we have comes from, the 10th or 11th century AD, when he was actually writing in the 3rd century AD CE. So, I mean, what you're talking about is just us missing, certain copies of it, not that these copies didn't exist then. And of course, if you're going to say that no copies existed up until like 400 or 500 years after they were supposedly written, then that's that argument of silence that you like to harp on me about. But in this case, there's no real reason to suggest that there were no copies. And then historians in ancient history, they regularly cite like where they got their information from. This is actually a hallmark of ancient historians. They would cite it in some kind of way that they got it from so and so in certain books and everything like that. Like they would cite them in various ways, but the point is that they would still cite them. So to suggest that the reason why Arian had to cite historical sources was because he wasn't living just a few decades after Alexander the Great really isn't representing the situation that we have with the Gospels. Because with the Gospels, we actually don't have Matthew writing in 45 or 50, which I know that we disagree on. I hold to the view that Matthew was actually writing in the 80s. So that means that he wasn't an eyewitness, that he didn't have personal firsthand knowledge of it. So he would definitely need to cite sources. So I agree on the basis of Paul, him writing in the 50s, he is an eyewitness, and that's why he doesn't have any kind of historical source. So just to put that kind of in perspective from my side.
Okay, well, I would comment on your continued reference to having, so you set the standard higher, and that's part of the problem for secular historians. We don't set a high standard, but for the Christians, we want to set a high standard. You want to refer to complete manuscripts in the 4th century as opposed to the fragments, which you keep trying to give the impression that these fragments are just little itty-bitty pieces of paper when they're pages after pages after pages, maybe 30, 40, 50 pages of documents that make up whole Gospels, or one in particular, one, P46, makes up 9 or 10 letters of the Apostle Paul. So these are not just, all of them are not just fragments. They cover the entire New Testament, and they're within decades of the 1st century. And then when you look at Homer's Iliad, its writing was completed in 800 BCE. The earliest manuscripts we have are from the 3rd century BCE. And guess what? These are fragments. So we're going to use the fragment argument. These are fragments that's supposed to cover, and Iliad is considered by historians 95% accurate. Isn't that amazing? 95% accurate, right? It's 500 years removed, and they're fragments. Now, the good news is the Iliad has lots of manuscripts. They have 1,750 manuscripts, but most of those manuscripts are 1,500 years away. The few that are in the 3rd century BCE are fragments, but they're still 500 years removed. So every argument that you're making for us is exactly true for the secular people. Exactly true. The same amount of, we have more than they have. We have more that should be trusted because it's closer to the date than they have. So I think the standard is set higher when you come to Christianity and the Bible than you do secular history. I mean, they say that based on some 500 years removed fragments, that the Iliad is 95% accurate. That's what they all say about the Iliad. But then you come to the Bible, and then we got some issues with some fragments. But our fragments aren't just little tiny fragments. 9, 10 letters of the Apostle Paul in P46. P75, 50 years removed from, or 75 years removed from John, has the Gospel of Luke and John in it. P66 has Gospels in it. So a lot of these manuscripts have multiple pages, and they all put together, they make up the New Testament more than one time. So you keep coming up with this brick wall in the 4th century, and that argument really doesn't float when the manuscript, P75 is 175 to 225. it is almost an exact representation of Codex Vaticanus that you keep mentioning that dates to 300 to 330. So that shows you that what was written in the Vaticanus is very accurate, because 100 years plus earlier rather, you have an exact representation in P75. So, I mean, that's...
I'll add one more remark. I wasn't making an argument for the Odyssey or any other documents other than what we have, what we were supposed to talk about tonight. So I just don't want anybody to get confused in thinking that I was making the same arguments for the Odyssey. So I don't have any opinion on the accuracy of the Odyssey.
No, I'm giving you what the historians, because you've referenced historians numerous times. So I'm giving you what historians say about the Homer's Iliad, that it's 95% accurate, and based on some fragments from, and of course it's based on other manuscripts that date 1,300, 1,500 years later, but they're willing to throw down and give you that. But then we have fragments that are whole books, fragments that are decades removed, and then we have two complete documents in the 4th century, not really quite complete, as you say, but complete enough in the 4th century, and then we have 5,900 some manuscripts, but we can't run with our 99.99%. Do you realize textual criticism is used on every historical document? Textual criticism is not something that's just for New Testament. Textual criticism and what was originally written or originally in a document is used on every historical document. So Thucydides, Herod, or Herodotus, all of those people, Tacitus, Homer, textual criticism is used on those documents, and they can get themselves to 95% on much less evidence than what we have, but we're not allowed to be able to say that ours is 99.99% when we have a mountain of evidence and compared to what they had. That just seems strange and unfair.
All right. That is all the questions that we have. And as always, I thank you guys for coming on and participating in this discussion or / debate. And I send out gifts. And I think I sent one to you, John. I think I sent one to you after you had a debate with Dr. Jonathan McClatchy. And so, Mr. Edward Andrews, I do want to give you a gift for your participation on the debate. And I will be reaching out to you to get the most local address I can get it to you at some way. I know you're over in Chile, but I do want to get you that gift because I do appreciate your time and effort that you took to prepare. I appreciate both of you for this. And that said, it was a great discussion, and I think the audience enjoyed it. And I just want to thank you guys for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. And if there's nothing else further, I'm going to close this thing out.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.